Not only are these issues important in their own right, but they should be front and center in any discussion about ending the border, breaking down partition and cementing unity across the island. If people who have been excluded, ignored, and sidelined from society aren't front and center in these discussions, then many may draw the conclusion that a united Ireland is not for them. And we don't want that. So the job of people here at this conference is to discuss how we can fuse the real desire for change and rights now with, I'm sure our excellent panel will go into more detail shortly. But the implementation of partition and the border itself was an attempt by British imperialism to thwart radical change in Ireland and right across the empire. And today the conversation is happening right across society about whether a border poll should happen, how to achieve unity, and what that type of united Ireland might look like. And that's, of course, a very welcome discussion. But I note that Boris Johnson has stated recently that in his view, there will not be a border poll for a very, very long time. And this is the obvious aim of the British ruling class, who have no concern about or desire for democracy. But that's far from the end of the story, because we've witnessed the sand shifting for some time across society in relation to this issue. It was settled, but it's been front and center of politics for the last 4 years or so now. And if we're to learn anything from Scotland, Catalonia, and other places, it's that simply waiting on a poll to be called or gifted to us will not work. We have to kickstart the conversations and discussions now. We have to ask, in light of increasing support for a united Ireland, which various polls have been showing, what are we to do if the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State dig their heels in even further? The only thing we have in our arsenal that will potentially change things and shift the narrative is people power, workers' power, the mass mobilization of ordinary people. And we have plenty of people in this conference who are heavily involved in various aspects right across this fight for change. Next week, we will have reached the 100th anniversary of partition. And despite efforts from the NIO, the British government, and many in the Southern establishment to celebrate and commemorate the founding of the Northern state and the Southern state, our task as radicals and as people on the left is to discuss how we can bring an end to the states that have cemented misery, poverty, bigotry, sectarianism, and inequality for so long. To discuss how we can bring about a new state, a new constitution, and new governance arrangements that put the oppressed, working class communities and all those ground down by capitalism at the front and center. So that's what we're aiming to do with today's conference. I want to thank you all for coming, for spending your day with us. And I would invite everybody to take part in the discussions and debate. Don't be afraid to ask questions, get involved. I hope you enjoy the conference and the day. And now to introduce our first panel and our first set of speakers. And this is a good one. We're starting off strong. We're going to be joined by Daniel Finn, Fergal Machvlusky, and Kieran Allen. All three of them very important thinkers and writers on politics, on left-wing politics, and indeed on this particular subject as well. So I'm going to open up with Kieran Allen. Kieran is a socialist. He's also written a whole load of books. He's a historian as well. He might actually argue with that description, but however, I'm giving it to him. He is the author of 1916, Ireland's Revolutionary Tradition. And he's got a book that will be released next week, and that's called The Failure of Partition and the Case for a United Ireland. And to find out more about that, you can go on. So without further ado, I am going to hand you over to Kieran.
Thanks, Shiva, and thanks everybody for coming at this early hour on Saturday morning. So I'll start with Boris Johnson's speech last week, where he said, as well as saying that there won't be a border poll for a very long, long time, He also described himself as a proud unionist. Now, what's interesting about these two statements, I'm a proud unionist and you won't be getting a border poll for a very, very long time, is that that stands in marked contrast to a very famous statement by a previous Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, namely Peter Brooke, in 1990, who said, and I'm quoting him, he said, "The British government has no strategic or economic interest in Northern Ireland. Our role is to encourage." Now, there's a bit of a contrast between these two statements because, I mean, how can you have no strategic interest in Northern Ireland and yet have the Prime Minister of Britain say he's a proud unionist? How can you pretend to have be a neutral referee between two communities and still deny a basic democratic right of a border poll for a very long, long time? Now, it seems to me that this contradiction gets to the heart of the matter, because for the last few decades, we have been subject in both the South, the North, and indeed for that matter in Britain itself, to a particular explanation of why Ireland was partitioned. And this explanation rests on the idea that partition is simply a reflection. It's simply the outcome of a deep conflict between two cultures. So the northern and southern states in Ireland are supposed to reflect the fact that in the north, there is a cultural divide between those who are Protestant, pro-monarchy, and have a British identity, and the south is supposed to be mainly a Catholic population, which has an Irish identity. That's been promoted by RTE, by BBC, and by essentially many of the conventional politicians. And I want to really challenge this explanation in this introductory discussion. And I just want to really make three main arguments against this approach. The first is that the actual boundaries of the northern state, the six-county state, has nothing to do with cultural identity. And we can see this in a number of ways. For example, in 1912, Edward Carson, the founder of unionism, voted for the Agar-Roberts Bill in the British House of Commons, which was the first bill to propose partition, but it was a four-county Ulster that he voted for. A few months after that, Carson introduced his own bill in the British House of Commons to essentially exclude Ulster, 9 counties, from a Home Rule bill. And in his motivation for a 9-county Ulster partition, he said, I'm quoting him, "It is far better statesmanship to exclude from Home Rule the whole of Ulster than to select counties which are, so to speak, all the one way." I think we understand what all the one way means here. In 1919, the British government set about bringing in the Government of Ireland Act, and the person charged with drawing that up was a man called Walter Long, who was essentially a unionist, a southern-based unionist, but according to his biography, his own biographer, he is described as somebody who held the Irish in contempt, thinking them culturally and racially. But the main point is, he, in drawing up the Government of Ireland Bill, proposed a 9-county Ulster as the basis of partition. But very quickly, after he took his boat to Dunleary Harbour, he never actually set foot in Dublin at the time, he got a communication from the Ulster Unionists that they did not want a 9-county Ulster. They wanted a 6 counties, which, as one of the founders of Ulster Unionism, Craig, put it, he says he wanted a decisive Protestant majority in which unionist power would be guaranteed in perpetuity. That's exactly his quote. So in other words, the northern state did not reflect the Protestant culture. There was no national movement looking for fixed boundaries. The whole effort was designed to incorporate a significant minority. And here we must understand what the function of a significant minority, a significant nationalist minority. If you had a significant nationalist minority in a 6-county Ulster rather than a 4-county Ulster, it was possible to cement unionist unity, to present unionism as under constant attack from a fifth column, and therefore this had the effect of creating a northern society which there was complete one-party rule for essentially from its foundation in 21 until 1972, where only one opposition bill was ever passed, namely the Wild Birds Act. Presumably birds were neither Catholic or Protestant. So the first point I want to make, therefore, is the northern state does not reflect the claim of a particular Protestant, or for that matter, British culture. Secondly, I think it's important to say that in most countries, cultural identity is fluid. I mean, unless, of course, you're oppressed and you're forced into a particular identity and you wish to use your traditional culture against your oppressor. But generally speaking, cultural identities are fluid. Now, if you ask somebody what exactly is at the core of a British identity, you will be told, and you can check this out in terms of loyalist spokespeople, you'll be told that what for them constitutes a British identity is parading, respect for monarchy, support for the security forces as the core element of a British identity. Now, there are two things wrong with this. The first is these are not cultural views as such. They're primarily political views. I mean, can you imagine anyone at the time of the French Revolution faced with a demand to abolish monarchy saying, I'm sorry, you can't even raise this. It is part of our culture. Moreover, if this is the basis of a British identity in the North, it is a reference to a Britain of bygone days. I mean, who now thinks of the Queen as a defender of the Protestant faith? Who in Britain now thinks, for example, that orange parades are part of a British identity? So the notion that this is a fixed cultural identity, I think we can question. Moreover, look at the contrast between Belfast and Glasgow. Both cities have a history of sectarianism, but in Glasgow, we find that sectarianism finds its expression mainly in the rivalry between Rangers and Celtic. It doesn't structure the politics of the city of Glasgow. In the northern state, however, people are locked into particular cultural identities. These identities didn't in themselves create the state, rather the state fostered and locked people into these cultural identities. The last problem with this argument is one I really just want to deal with, is that what it does is it presents Britain as a neutral observer, as somebody who was faced with this difficult, intractable Irish problem and had little choice but to move to partition. And what this ignores is that partition was promoted by the most right-wing Tory elements of the British establishment in order to buttress empire and to win a mass support base for the idea of empire, and for that matter, the idea of monarchy and aristocracy. Now, sometimes we look on history in this part of the world from an Irish point of view, and one of the great tragedies of this conflict in many ways, we don't learn British history. But when we actually look at the issue from a British point of view, in terms of how partition came into existence, we find that partition arose in the context of three main crises facing the British ruling class. The first was the Parliament Act of 1911, when, as a result of a row where the Liberal Party, in order to appease its working class base, wanted to talk about a modest tax on landed estates. This drove the House of Lords into paroxysm of rage, and as a result, Liberals were forced to bring in a bill, the Parliament Act, to remove the veto of the House of Lords. This then became the rallying point for the Tories, and the Tories decided that strategically, the main way they would rally the population was around the issue of Ireland to overcome divisions in their own ranks. And it's for this reason they formed an alliance with Edward Carson. And what's often dropped out of the picture in terms of Carson is that Carson was probably the most right-wing politician you could find in Ireland at the time. He was known as Coercion Carson for, if you like, backing up landlords who wanted to evict tenants. He opposed the 1906 Trade Union Act. He obviously was involved in the jailing of Oscar Wilde. He supported an imperialist called Jim Jameson, who was a supporter of Cecil Rhodes, precisely to quote his biographer, who was willing to flout the law for the good of the empire. And therefore, the Tory decision to form an alliance with Carson was linked very much to a breach in any norm with the idea of parliamentary democracy. Let's look at what Bonner Law actually told a rally of Carson supporters in 1912. He says they were facing a revolutionary committee. This is what he describes the British government, a revolutionary committee which has seized power by fraud upon despotic power. In our opposition to them, we will not be guided by any consideration which would influence us in ordinary political struggle. We shall use any means to deprive them of power they usurped. So in other words, partition arose from a Tory reaction to defend the idea of a veto on the House of Commons and to use the most reactionary mechanisms to overthrow even minimal democracy. The second context of a crisis in the British ruling class was a revolt throughout the empire. And again, a slightly insular view of history, we often don't read enough about the massive protests in Egypt in 1919, where 800 people were murdered, in India and the Punjab, where 1,000 people were murdered, and where, by the way, Carson supported the killings of those people in the Punjab at the time. And faced with this situation of revolts throughout the empire, the Tories could not allow the Irish national revolutionary movement to achieve any sort of victory. And lastly, of course, there is that revolutionary movement itself, which was a mass movement involving hundreds of thousands of people, which involved boycotts, strikes, armed struggle. And the partition, therefore, was an attempt to defang and to, if you like, obstruct that movement. And it was part of a strategy of winning over a section of the nationalist leadership to compromise with British imperialism, a compromise that finally came to its fruition when Michael Collins tragically shelled the forecourts with guns provided by his former enemies, the British. So therefore, it's important to see that partition could not have come into existence without the active support of British imperialism. They funded it. They get permission for the establishment of Ulster Special Constabulary, composed of Orangemen. They allowed James Craig to move directly from being Parliamentary Secretary of the Admiralty in a British cabinet to becoming the first Prime Minister of the six-county statelet. And finally, therefore, why is all this of relevance today? And the reason why I think it's of relevance today is we've now entered a period when the national question is returning and where the line of the establishment is that this is really an intractable conflict between Irish people that will have to be solved by some sort of long conversation that will go on for years and years. Britain has slipped off into the sidelines, and even the term British imperialism is unfashionable. But let's put it very simply like this. Britain is the 7th biggest capitalist power in the world. It presents itself as a major ally of the main imperial power, the USA. It has fought 8 wars since the start of the 21st century. It channels vast sums of the world's rich into tax havens, and its military prowess and the size and authority of its state is used to back up and win concessions for British corporations. And therefore, when you look at it from this point of view, does anyone see are going to let go of Scotland and let go of Northern Ireland without a fight? They will fight to the end. And no amount of love bombing with letters to the Queen or apologies is going to shift them from that. And that means, in my view, that we need a mass popular movement to put on pressure for a border poll, just as we did in the South with repeal and marriage equality. We will also, by the way, need mass popular pressure to carry through on any positive results. But to win that referendum, we will need to promote a different vision of a radical socialist united Ireland, not one of unity based on stitching together 2 rotten states.
Thanks a million, Kieran. That was a really, really good start, I think, to the conference, breaking down some of the misconceptions about the very founding of the 2 states, which have massive implications for how we address the question of unity today, and shows kind of the diversion between kind of what people at this conference are saying and, you know, versus the mainstream narrative and the mainstream talking points around this. So moving on, oh, sorry, before I say that, there is, as I mentioned before the start of Kieran's contribution, he will be launching a book. It is going to be a very, very interesting book that will elaborate further on some of the points that he was making this morning. The book is called 32 Counties, The Failure of Partition and the Case for a United Ireland. And it will be launching next Friday evening at 7:30 on May the 7th. Is that next Friday? Yes, I think it is. Or if it isn't, it is May the 7th. So put that in your diaries, 7:30, Friday, May the 7th, the book launch will be taking place, and that will be a really, really interesting event. The details are on the Rebel News website. So moving on, we have two more brilliant speakers today on this panel. Our next speaker is Fergal McFlusky. He historian. He has written extensively on Irish history, including on Fenians and Ribbon Men. He does excellent research and writings on class, sectarianism, and republicanism in Tyrone at the start of the century. So I'm going to hand you guys over now to Fergal.
So I think what I'll do is I'll kind of produce some on what the pogrom in particular meant in Belfast and what really underpinned partition in this period. And it would probably be a good start to quote James Connolly, who, writing from his home off Hugo Street, the Falls Road in 1913, said, if in the northeast corner of Ireland is therefore the home of a people whose minds are saturated with conceptions of political activity fit only for the atmosphere of the 17th century, thus the contractarian ideology that Kieran mentioned in terms of the monarchy and the Orange Order itself set up in the 18th century in order to copper fasten the Protestant supremacy. In fact, there's a great line from Thomas Knox, the future Lord Monforty, writing, you know, the big house unionist writing at the time to a friend. He says, despite their licentious character, we will depend on the Orange men for our lives and property. And this kind of tribunal or this relationship within unionism and loyalism finds its expression in the 1780s and carries right through until the present day in very many respects. And but Connolly says, and he makes it very, very clear that he doesn't blame the Protestant working class for this. In fact, he blames it on the pastors and masters, as he calls them, who deceive them and enslaved them in the past and deceived them in order that they might enslave them. But I think his key line is, but as no good can come of blaming it, so also no good but infinite evil can come from truckling to it. Let the truth be told, however ugly. So I'm going to give you a wee bit of ugly truth about the nature of partition. After the pogrom, which begins after Protestant workmen returned from the traditional July holidays, workmen and clerk workers and hold a meeting, and then they invade the larger yard or the big yard, Harn and Wolf. This leads to the expulsion over the period of 2 years of 23,000 people from them, the vast majority of them Catholics. Eamon Phoenix, the historian, suggests that up to 50,000 Northern nationalists left the North in this 2 year period. That's about 10% of the population. Between July 1920 and 22, 557 people are killed in what becomes the 6 counties. But that does a disservice to the intensity of the conflict, because we're really talking about Belfast here. In Belfast, the conflict's epicenter, Kieran Glennon's accident work has identified 498 killings between July 1920 and October 1922, including 266 Catholic and 181 Protestant civilians, or 90% of the fatalities. Nowhere else in Ireland do we witness this level of indiscriminate killings of civilians based on a fundamentally sectarian premise. And my big argument here, and this, again, I'll probably mention some of the things that Kieran has said, is that this notion that these two identities, this orange and green identity, are immutable concepts, is somewhat undermined by the actual history of partition. I would argue that partition operates on a fusion. You've mentioned my first book, Fenians and Ribbon Men, there, which was informed by Gramsci and Roudet. It's an infusion, really, of derived concepts of British high imperialism that Carson would have believed in. We mentioned Lord Milner and Walter Long and the Tory elite were very, very obvious exponents of her, and a fusion of this derived high imperialism and an inherent colonial settler ideology in Ulster, in and around Belfast in particular. Now, this is locked into the very nature of the state by the means by which the Unionist leadership consolidate their position. Not in 1921, whenever the Parliament opens, but in 1920, whenever they create the Orange economy in which this Parliament and statelet is subsequently built. And the best way to try and understand this in as brief a time as possible is to look at the origins of the organisation which was used by the Unionist leadership to carry out this pogrom. And this organisation is called the Ulster Unionist Labour Association. Now, the Ulster Unionist Labour Association gets its inspiration, Carson essentially creates it. It gets its inspiration from the British Workers' League, which was under the patronage of Lord Milner. And Lord Milner, if anyone knows, set up the kindergarten in South Africa, the Round Table Conference. He called himself a race patriot. He also oversaw the murder really of 28,000 Boer women and children and 20,000 black people in the concentration camps during the Boer War. And we mentioned the Jameson raid there previously. So during the Home Rule crisis, Milner formed with Walter Long, who's already been mentioned, the Ulster Union Defence League to rescue, and this is a quote, the white settler colony of Ulster from submersion in a sea of inferior Celts. Okay, Carson himself later privately opined that Irish Catholics were, and this is a quote, really far from civilised, and that the Celts have done nothing in Ireland but create trouble and disorder. And in his introductory letter to Carson, requesting a straight and confidential talk in December 1913, Milner impressed that Ulster's position, and he underlined it, goes very deep with me. Milner claimed that Ulster's uprising of unshakable principles and devoted patriotism of loyalty to the Empire and to the flag had stirred him from political retirement as it went, and again a quote, far deeper than ordinary party struggle and required much more than mere talk. And Kieran's already mentioned the fact that these, Tory plutocrats and imperialists were prepared to subvert the entire democratic process in Britain in order to restrain what were quite, marginal democratic advances proposed by the liberal wing of the British political establishment. Now, Milner sets up the British Workers' League, or he patronises the British Workers' League and the British Empire Union. And these are both proto-fascist organisations which are trying to get elements of the British working class, remove them from the emerging British labour movement, and then attach them to a type of social imperialism. Carson is also a leading member of both these organisations. Now, the British Workers' League will become quite prominent, or reasonably prominent, in British politics after the coup election, because they stand as members of what's called the National Democratic Party, and they join Lloyd George's coalition with the Tories. Now, what Carson does, he uses the British Workers' League as the inspiration for the creation of the Ulster Unionist Labour Association. Now, this is a bit of a misnomer, because the Ulster Unionist Labour Association is chaired by the owner of a mill, J.M. Andrews, who will subsequently be Minister for Labour. Your Minister of Labour's a capitalist, and he's also subsequently the Prime Minister of the North during the Second World War. But the organisation itself is essentially created by Carson and controlled by the Secretary of the Ulster Unionist Council, Richard Dawson Bates, who will go on to gain infamy really as the Minister of Home Affairs, the first Minister of Home Affairs in Craig's Northern Government. The Ulster Unionist Labour Association are set up to counter the beginnings of a nascent socialist movement in Belfast that finds perhaps its most famous expression in the January 1919 general strike in Belfast for a 44-hour week amongst, and we'll be very honest here, Protestant workers who haven't, to all intents and purposes, changed their constitutional position, but are prepared to essentially shut the city down within the conditions of an immediate post-war boom. The resupply to the market after the war leads to a boom which crashes devastatingly in the spring and early summer of 1920, which has serious implications for this working class movement in Belfast. Now, 1919, there's 90,000 people employed in the linen mills, and there's 30,000 people employed in the shipyards. That's a 10,000 increase from the pre-war figure. And the city's 30,000 shipyard workers come out on strike, and they're joined by the municipal and the millies, or the women, who are particularly socialist in their politics in this period. But over 60,000 people come out. Now, you have to make a distinction here between the constitutional outlook of these workers and the people who are involved in the strike committee, because many of the people who are involved in the strike committee are clearly anti-partitionist. We're not saying that they're Sinn Féiners. We're not saying that, they want a republic, but they adhere to the British Labour Party's position of this period, which is that Ireland is entitled to self-determination, and they're anti-partitionist. Okay, so you have to understand the Ulster Unionist Labour Association as a response to a large degree of trade union militancy in this period. And Bates writes to Carson in June 1919, worried about the way in which the situation leads the younger members of the working class to socialist, i.e. extreme organisations run by the independent Labour Party, as he calls them, where they are educated in views very different from those held by our body, the Ulster Unionist Labour Association. Now, essentially what happens is, because of the favourable position of Labour in January 1919, and because of the fact that an awful lot of unionists backed this strike, the unionist leadership do not clamp down on Labour in 1919. Okay, there's 100,000 people take armed part in Belfast. That's the same. Bill Craig used to give meetings of it during the 70s, talking about liquidating the enemies of Ulster. 100,000 workers mobilised in May Day in 1918, and they were led in very many respects by this socialist tendency within Belfast, who find political expression in what's called the Belfast Labour Party, which opposes the Irish Labour Parties and Thomas Johnson, who himself cut his teeth really in Belfast, opposed his decision to abstain from the 1918 general election. And they stand candidates in 4 predominantly Protestant working class general election. They get about a fifth or a quarter of the vote. And then they stand again, more importantly, in the January 1920 municipal elections in Belfast. Now, there's some dispute about how many victorious candidates they have. 12 out of the 13 express anti-partitionist beliefs. So it's, under D.R. Campbell, it's thought that there are 12 anti-partitionist Labour candidates elected to Belfast Corporation in January 1920. This is an election where the Unionists get 33, the Nationalists and Sinn Féin get 6. Independent anti-partitionist Labour are the opposition in Belfast City Hall. And they're elected not by nationalists, they're elected by typically unskilled Protestant workers. Sam Kay tops the poll in the Shankill ward. Yeah, Sam Kay, who's in favour of Irish self-determination and is a socialist, and whose name is blackened really by the Ulster Unionist Labour Association and James Turkington, and the head of the Yellow Union, the Ulster Workers' Union. And he carries his running mate Dawson Gordon, and Dawson Gordon has organised the Millies, or the female mill workers across Protestants and Catholics since 1916. And it's the election of these candidates, trade union activism. Okay, now the unionist establishment have a hurdle to clear before they can crush this nascent trade union movement. I could probably go into some lovely details about their first appearance at the meeting in Belfast City Hall, but I know I'm tight for time. But James Bird, who the Boilermakers Union is shipyard worker, and himself, he turns up in Dungarees, and then Dennis Houston, who's elected for the Belfast Labour Party in the Falls constituency, he gives a speech in Irish. So you can see the heterogeneous sort of character of this broad movement. But anyway, what essentially happens is that the unionist leadership have to push 6 county partition through, and we'll probably talk about the nature of that later on in questions. And they have to manage this before they can crush this nascent trade union movement. So there's an awful lot of anti-soul searching, as what James Strong, the leader of the Orange Order in Ireland from Armagh, says about the manner in which we threw the unionists in the 3 other counties to the wolves. He says, threw them to the wolves. And I might go into, I know I'm tight for time, but James Craig says that the Ulster Covenant of 1912 is not a compact for suicide. That's how he describes it. So first of all, they clear the hurdle of they gain acceptance for 6 county partition in the Ulster Unionist Council. And Dawson Bates does all this, right? It's passed at a meeting in March, particularly one honourable unionist from Tyrone, a man called Ambrose St. Quentin Ricardo, who's actually related to the famous economist, and he will subsequently lead the Ulster Special Constabulary and write damning reports about this organisation to Stephen Tallants, who's a British civil servant who will carry out an investigation into sectarian violence in the north. They then demand a subsequent meeting in May, and 6 county partition is pushed through. It's on this premise then that the unionist leadership purge the economy of the 6 counties of unreliable or disloyal elements. And that basically means rotten prods, these Protestant trade unionists, and the Catholics. So now on the 18th of June 1920, the Ulster Ex-Servicemen's Association, which is an explicitly sectarian organisation, they write in a letter to Carson, 95% Orange men. Okay, you have to be a Protestant to be in it. So a lot of this mythology about the shared sacrifice between Catholics and Protestants in the First World War, Belfast Catholics were 4 times more likely to enlist than Catholics anywhere else in Ireland. But the loyalists wouldn't join the British Legion or the comrades of the Great War. Sorry, they set up their own explicitly sectarian organisation. They write to Carson, using all means in our power to restore law and order. And after violence broke out between the IRA and the UVF in Derry, which the British essentially facilitated on the loyalist side, Belfast shipyard workers petitioned Carson to mobilise the UVF to take revenge. Little did they know Carson had been doing this through Fred Crawford since March. And then he meets the Ulster Unionist Labour Association. And then he gives his famous speech at Finnegan. He says, these men who come forward as friends of Labour care no more about Labour than does the man on the moon. They are trying to sell you into enslavement. I hate words without actions. And it's in this response, it's very little to do with the assassination of Smith and his return to Banbridge. This is a premeditated attack to purge the main centres of employment of rotten prods, Protestant trade unionists and Catholics. And the reason why we know this is that there's a disciplinary hearing within the minute books of the Ulster Unionist Labour Association, which says that they planned this meeting subsequently. But it is common knowledge in Belfast and frequently admitted by individual unionists that plans were matured at least 2 months ago to drive all home rule workmen in the shipyards out of their employment. Now, the subsequent assassination of Oswald Mosley, who was involved in the murder of the Lord Mayor of Cork, Thomas McCurtain, leads to the expulsion of 300 Catholic families from Lisburn. Similar scenes had taken place in Banbridge and Dromore with the assassination of Smith. So what you get in the north of Ireland in the summer of 1920 are the only real instances during the revolutionary period of what could be described as ethnic cleansing. So Oswald, I might have said Mosley there instead of Swansea. Oswald Swansea. So and Fred Crawford reports on the scenes in Lisburn. He says it was like a bombarded town in France. Fred Crawford, the hardline loyalist, Lauren Gunnery, says the only problem was that some of the fire spread to Protestant houses. Now, the afterlife of these expulsions finds expression in the fact that people who want to gain employment have to sign loyalty cards, okay, declarations of loyalty. And vigilance committees are set up by the Ulster Unionist Labour Association not to admit disloyal elements back into the shipyards and the main engineering plants. And Onyx McKay, who's a Ulster Unionist Labour Association councillor from Bangor, addressed shipyard workers and he called them gentlemen of the Imperial Guard. We are all imperialists, and the reason we are met today is because we believe in imperial authority. And he also described them as the black and tans of industry. Now, what's Craig and Carson's response to this? Craig goes down to the shipyard and presents them with a flag, and he says, do I agree with what you boys did? I do. Carson calls the shipyard workers, the loyalist pogromists, his greatest friends in the world in the House of Commons. The British government then employ these pogromists as the Ulster Special Constabulary, which is in September 1920, and our friend Ricardo, who I've already described, basically says that the British government's plea to all well-disposed citizens can be safely viewed as camouflage, and this will be a wholly Protestant force. And this wholly Protestant force is then employed to implement the will of essentially what is a reactionary Orange government in Belfast. Now, this again finds expression in the elections, the 6th County Parliament the following May 1921, when 4 Labour candidates, amongst them Jimmy Bird, who I've talked about already, they booked the Ulster Hall, and the shipyard workers, who, by the way, have already broken up a meeting to protest about the expulsion of workers in the Ulster Hall using revolvers, in Belfast City Hall using revolvers. They then seize the Ulster Hall, and they send a telegram to Craig, mass meeting of loyal shipyard workers who have captured Ulster Hall from the Bolsheviks Bird, Midgley and Hannah. Request you address them for a few minutes tonight. Craig replied, I am with them in spirit. No way will do their bit. I will do mine. Well done, big and wee yards. And I finish now. And this operates within the context then of the Special Powers Act, and everybody knows the famous line from Balthazar Voster. He said he'd trade all the apartheid legislation for one clause of the Special Powers Act. That's implemented by Dawson Bates. In 1924, in England and Wales, there was one policeman for every 700 people. In Scotland, it was one for every 750. In the north of Ireland, it was one for every 160. Right? And that police force was directed primarily the nationalist population. Okay, on the 4th of January, and I'd finish with this quote, and we're referring back to the reactionary nature of this ideology. On the 4th of January 1923, the Belfast Newsletter, I'm sure you've read plenty of worthwhile snippets from it recently, carried an article on the Ku Klux Klan and Italian fascist movement, which claimed that while undemocratic at root, it would be absurd to underestimate the significance of such movements or to ignore what is noble in their intentions. Their strength springs from the genuine desire to make life sweeter and more wholesome. Fortunately, here government rested on the will of the people rather than on the symbolism of white hood or black shirt. But it would if you deliberately engineered a border so that you would have a majority in perpetuity. This was confirmed in April 1924, by the way, when the National Army and the IRA noted the creation of branches of the Ku Klux Klan in Tyrone and Belfast. In fact, the branch in Belfast was quite strangely named the Gay Crusaders. Okay, and in 1934, Craig himself said that the Orange Order and the Black Brotherhood or B Specials could substitute as fascists. So I'll leave you with that snippet.
Gur mai agat fergal, bhí sin anna himmeler fad agus tá brownarm growing sais críoch but
no,
that was brilliant. Really, really interesting, fascinating, and very detailed. Which is, you've got the right audience here for all of that. Really, really interesting stuff. So we're now going to be concluding with our third speaker. Our third speaker is Daniel Finn. He's an author of One Man's Terrorist: A Political History of IRA. He's also a member of the editorial board of New Left Review and also of Jacobin. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Daniel, who is going to wrap up. There's a whole load of talks on today, as you all know, loads of really interesting stuff. I'll just let you know a bit more about that after, but over to Daniel.
Thanks, Shiva, and thanks everyone for coming along this morning. I'm going to talk about the way people on the left, the radical left, have understood partition over the last century, going back to James Connolly. So building on what Virgil have said about the actual historical facts of partition, I'm going to talk more about theories and theoretical understandings of what happened. As many of you will know, I'm sure, James Connolly was firmly against partition. Of course, he didn't leave to see partition actually being put into effect in the 1920s, but when it was first put on the agenda at the time of the Home Rule crisis in the run-up to the First World War, he was passionately opposed to it. And some of the arguments that he made, some of the phrases that he uses will be familiar to people, even if they haven't read any articles or any book. That phrase, a carnival of reaction, is one of those almost free-floating phrases in Irish political history, like a terrible beauty is born. Whether or not people have read the original source, they might be familiar with the phrase itself. And Connolly's argument at the time was that partition would be a disaster, it would be unjustified and unjustifiable, and that the labour movement should fight against it. And that was the position that he handed on to people carrying on in that tradition, which over the next 50 years was largely a marginal tradition, the radical socialist or Marxist tradition in Irish politics. It was on the margins, both north and south, but people held to the position that partition should not have happened, and that part of the political agenda for a left-wing workers' movement in Ireland should be ending partition. Now, that would bring together a wide range of opinions about how you could end partition, by what tactics and according to what time frame, but the general position was that it should be ended sooner or later. But it was coming into the late 60s and the early 70s, precisely at the time when there was a renewed outbreak of conflict in the north, that an intellectual tendency took shape, which argued against Connolly's position, against opposition to partition from within the left and from within a broadly socialist or Marxist framework. And it wasn't a coincidence, of course, that it came at the same time as the renewal of conflicts and a campaign of guerrilla warfare by the Provisional IRA, precisely directed against ending partition and establishing a unitary Irish state. And the general basis of this tendency that I'm talking about was to say that actually partition was inevitable. There had to be some form of partition back in the 1920s, and that today it did not need to be any part of a left-wing program. In left-wing movements could just as well pursue their goals within the existing framework of two partition states on the island. Some of the people who were associated with this line of thought, Conor Cruise O'Brien was a particularly prominent figure with his book States of Ireland in the early 1970s. Now, it might surprise people who are familiar with Conor Cruise O'Brien's later intellectual and political development to think that he was ever associated with the left. You know, by the late 90s, he was campaigning against the Good Friday Agreement from the right in alliance with Ian Paisley and Robert McCartney. But certainly in the 1960s, coming towards the turn of the decade, he was still very much perceived as a man of the left, in particular in relation to colonial questions, partly because of the role he had played during the Congo crisis in the early 1960s. And some of his later writings in 1970, for example, he published a short book about Albert Camus, where he criticized Camus for refusing to support Algerian independence and praised Jean-Paul Sartre for having a better line of opposition to French colonialism. So that was the perception of O'Brien when he published this book, States of Ireland, which had a big impact over subsequent decades. And it included quite a long critical analysis of James Connolly, of his work Labour in Irish History, arguing that Connolly had failed to come to terms with the development of the Ulster Protestant community over the course of the 19th century. A more elaborate version of the British and Irish Communist Organisation, or BICO for short, which may seem on the face of it to be a rather eccentric story. The fact that you had a group of Irish Maoists who were warmly praised by Enoch Powell for their position on the national question. But despite the fact that they were quite a small group, they had an outsized influence. They had a strong influence in the academic literature, which you'll see to this day. And they also had a political influence, not so much through their own work, but through their ideas being taken up by others. For example, one big fan of theirs in the early 1970s was David Trimble, when he was working with William Craig in Vanguard. And Trimble has said that he felt BICO were making a better case for the unionist position than the unionists themselves at the time. He invited people from BICO to come along to meetings of the Ulster Workers' Council at the time of the movement against Sunningdale. And at a much later stage in the late 90s, when he was helping to negotiate the Good Friday Agreement, he put together what was known as his brains trust of intellectual advisors. And it included people who would have been very strongly influenced by BICO at the time, people like Paul Bew and Austin Morgan and Owen Harris. Another ironic, perhaps, side effect of BICO's influence was the birth of the Northern Ireland Conservatives when the Tory party began running candidates in the North in the 1980s. That was ultimately the result of an initiative that came from BICO, and they also fed into the thinking of the official Republican movement in the 1970s as they became the Workers' Party, and into the thinking of some of the intellectuals associated with that, such as Owen Harris, such as Paul Bew and Henry Patterson, whose work is very influential in history and historiography about the North to the present day. Now, what was the basis for this tendency? It started off with one key insight that you have to acknowledge the validity of this insight, which was that traditional Irish nationalism had not really come to terms with the separate development of the majority of Protestants in Ulster over the course of the 19th century. Whether it was possible or not that back in the 1790s, the United Irishmen clearly had mass support from Ulster Presbyterians as well as from Catholics in the rest of the island, and whether that could have established an Irish Republic at the time. In the decades that followed and coming up to the period, the late 19th century and the early 20th century, the United Irishmen had vanished as a political force, whereas the Orange Order, which had also been formed in the 1790s, had remained a central part of Ulster Protestant society, and the majority of Ulster Protestants did not consider themselves to be part of the Irish national community as that was defined by the nationalist organisations, whether it was the Home Rule Party or the Irish Republican Brotherhood. they pointed out, people associate with this tendency, that traditional Irish nationalism had tended to define the Irish nation by reference to geography, to simply take it for granted that people who were born on the island were part of the Irish nation, and to speak in a rather patronizing way about Ulster Protestants and Ulster Unionists who simply did not consider themselves to be part of that community. Now, all of that is really undeniable for anyone who's looked at the political and cultural development of Ireland over the 19th and 20th centuries. But the question then is, once you acknowledge that, what do you do with it? What are the political conclusions that you draw from it? And this is where this tendency really falls short, because it became associated with what was known as the two nations theory. And what is difficult about the two nations theory is not this perception that you have more than one political and cultural community on the island, but the conclusion that is drawn from that by the likes of Byco and people like Paul Bew and Henry Pattison and Conor Cruise O'Brien and others, which was that partition was inevitable, and that because there are different cultural communities on the island, the only way to reflect that and to recognize that was to have two states and to exclude the majority of Ulster from the independent Irish state. And it completely glosses over this line of thought, the nature of the partition settlement as it was actually put into effect. Because even if you were to concede, for the sake of argument, that some form of partition was inevitable at that time, clearly the way that the partition settlement was actually put into effect in the 1920s was not inevitable. It was dependent on choices that were made in the course of the War of Independence and the treaty negotiations. And it was overwhelmingly one-sided. And this is something that Conor Cruise O'Brien, for example, acknowledged at the beginning of States of Ireland, but then put to one side and didn't really work into his analysis at all. He pointed out that the one-sided character of the partition settlement, the fact that there was no large town or county in the south that had a unionist majority, but there were several counties and large towns in the north that had a nationalist majority, and that reflected the fact that when push came to shove, the position of the British state and the British ruling class was to support precisely what was being demanded by the leadership of Ulster Unionism, by the likes of Edward Carson and James Craig, and to use its power to support their position. So this, this feeds into arguments at a later stage where, for example, in their work, people like Paul Bew and Henry Pattison, they would have had a more subtle position than the theorists associated with Byco, whereas the Byco writers like Brendan Clifford's just denied in a straightforward fashion that there was any intentional sectarian discrimination against the nationalist minority within the state. And they argued that to the extent that nationalists were disadvantaged at all, it was their own fault for failing to recognize the state and obliging the leadership of unionism to deny them equal rights. That's an argument that they made in the early 70s. But people like Paul Bew and Henry Pattison, for example, in their book, The State in Northern Ireland, which was a very influential book in the late 70s, and in their subsequent work, they would acknowledge that, yes, there was discrimination against the nationalist minority, and that it was by no means accidental, that it was the product of choices that were made, intentional political discrimination made by the leadership of Ulster Unionism. But they went on to argue that this had nothing to do with the partition settlement as such. The sectarian deformations of the state in Northern Ireland, as far as they were concerned, was something that could have been resolved without having to question the partition settlement at all. And their ideal would have been to have an alignment of politics in the north along class lines, and they would have seen the Northern Ireland Labour Party as the force that was going to supplant the dominance of unionism, but without questioning partition and without questioning the place of Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom. And what this really glosses over is the fact that once you had the partition settlement put into effect in the way that it was in the 1920s, the subsequent development of the state in North of Ireland was more or less inevitable, because once you had this very large nationalist minority, it was natural that nationalists would withhold recognition from the new state, because they understood perfectly well the one-sided and discriminatory nature of the partition settlement. There was no reason why people in Tyrone or Fermanagh or Derry City were simply going to reconcile themselves to being part of this state. And because the state included large areas where there was a clear-cut nationalist majority, the only way that you could have the political hegemony of unionism within those areas was through fairly crude sectarian gerrymandering, the features of which I'm sure many people would be familiar with in areas like Tyrone and Fermanagh and Derry City, and which continued right up to the 1960s. And once you had that in place, then in a sense, the die was cast for the whole subsequent development of Northern Ireland as a political entity. The idea that you could have some sort of realignment of politics along class lines simply was not going to happen, because while the nationalist minority was too small to pose a direct threat to the existence of the state, it was never going to be possible to outvote unionism either in an election or in a referendum. Nevertheless, it was large enough that it could be presented as a kind of threat, as a kind of bogeyman. And it was enough to say, now this goes back to the late 1920s when James Craig stated this very clearly when he brought in a bill to change the voting system for Stormont to get rid of proportional representation. He had already got rid of PR for local government elections in the early 1920s, and now he wanted to get rid of it for Stormont elections. And he stated quite openly that his intention in doing so was to ensure that every election in the North would be a kind of proxy referendum on the question of partition. He didn't want to see any kind of political fragmentation of unionism. He was just as worried about Protestant voters supporting Labour candidates or supporting independent unionist candidates as he was about success for nationalism. So that was his goal. You know, you don't have to infer this. You don't have to look into private documents or private correspondence or anything like this. This is something that Craig stated on the public record in Stormont at the time. And he achieved his goal for the next 40 years. The main axis of political alignment in the North was Green versus Orange, Nationalist versus Unionist, and it was successful in maintaining that majoritarian basis for politics. And of course, what underpins that one-sided nature of the partition settlement was the direct intervention of the British state, the British ruling class, and British imperialism in the 1920s. And this is something that is really left out by this whole revisionist political tendency, whether it's the left-wing Marxist version of revisionism or the more general view associated with people like Roy Foster, for example, in Irish history. It's one thing to say that Ulster Unionism has a life of its own and that it's not simply a sock puppet of the British state or the British ruling class, which is clearly true. It's another thing to say that the calculations made by politicians and state managers and political actors in London have no impact, not just an impact on, on the facts on the ground in Ireland, but also an impact on the political calculations that people make, both nationalists and unionists, because of course, unionists are rational political actors like everyone else, just as nationalists are rational political actors, and they make their choices about what goals to pursue and what compromises to make on the basis of the overall political context. And so having the British state, which at the time of partition was the most powerful state in the world, and to this day is one of the more powerful states in Europe and in world politics, that clearly makes a big difference to people's political calculations. And so the relevance of this for politics today, it is really important to push back against this tendency to remove the role of the British state and the British political class and British nationalism from shaping politics on the ground in the north of Ireland. And I suppose it's easier to make this point to people now than it was in the late 90s. Certainly there was a tendency to argue that the British state and the British political class, whatever may have been the case in the past, was no longer a partisan actor when it came to Ireland and when it came to the partition of Ireland. That statement that was made by Peter Brook at the turn of the 1990s and was subsequently reiterated by people like John Major and Tony Blair was largely taken at face value by people right across political and intellectual life in Ireland and in the wider world. And it was built into what you might call the theology of the peace process, the idea that the British state was a neutral actor. And it was easier to make that case in the late 90s because Tony Blair was very much a British nationalist still, and he was self-described a unionist, someone who had a political commitment to the union. But the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement came in the context of a somewhat more subtle and more pluralist definition of British nationalism being put into effect by New Labour. It wasn't just a peace process in the North and Good Friday Agreement, it was also the devolution settlement in Scotland and Wales. And so it was one thing to make that argument in the late 90s and the early 2000s. Even then, it was clearly misleading and apologetic because the British state always had interests there. And you saw this in the handling of security reform and in the handling of inquiries into collusion, where Blair's government remained adamantly opposed to having a full-scale public inquiry into the murder of Pat Finucane, because they knew very well it would raise all sorts of questions and reveal all kinds of unwelcome secrets about what the whole British security and intelligence machine have been doing in the North, not just RUC Special Branch, which to some extent could be pawned off and pensioned off, but also MI5 and the British Army. So that was always the case. But now, in the last decade and in the last 5 years in particular, it's completely implausible and untenable to argue that the British state and British nationalism does not have a direct partisan impact on politics in the north of Ireland, because the greatest single disrupting and destabilizing factor in politics there in the last few years has come from the centre of the United Kingdom. It's not a question of politicians in the centre trying to keep the peace or hold the ring between contesting national communities in the north of Ireland. The main disruptive force has been the Brexit project and the way it has been managed by the Conservative Party, both by Theresa May and now by Boris Johnson. And we've seen it very obviously in the last few months and the last few weeks. And that still holds really, regardless of whether you assume that the British political class and the Conservative Party in particular has a partisan view on the partition of Ireland. Because even if you were to say that Boris Johnson and people around him are neutral on the question of whether partition might end or not, and that they don't particularly care about the north of Ireland and that they would be happy to cast it off, that doesn't change the fact that their own partisan political alignments on questions to do with British nationalism and the British state have a very direct, tangible impact on what happens in the north. And so far, the implementation of Brexit and the unfolding of that project has had a more profound impact on Irish politics than on British politics, even if the leading protagonists behind that project weren't really thinking about Ireland at all when they pushed it forward. Another contemporary political question and lesson to be drawn for this is around the question of a border poll. That there has been a tendency for people to say that in the event of a border poll, a straightforward majority should not be enough, that there should be a super majority, or that there should be some kind of other procedure put in place.